The topic that we're going to cover in this series of videos is on the trumpets in Joel and understanding Joel. This is beginning application. During 2013 to 2014, when I first studied the book of Joel very intensely, very thoroughly, I understood about the trumpets, but I didn't quite understand the application. So I'm really grateful that Brother Deontay Jefferson has done a number of presentations just on this topic, and so then I've added to that by what I'm going to present today. So I'm going to suggest, as we explore this topic, that you return to reading in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, because there's application of that to the trumpets, to the sanctuary, and the solemn assembly, and then also return to understanding what the sanctuary service really meant in the Bible and how that applies as we are considering righteousness by faith and accepting Jesus. So first turn to Numbers chapter 10. That's what we're going to cover. And when you look at Numbers 10, you find in verse 2 of Numbers that there's a call to an assembly by blowing the trumpets, and that the call to assembly is a call to God's people to make a journey. So there's a call to assemble at the sanctuary, to assemble for a number of other purposes, and to make a journey. So the trumpets have to do with telling God's people what God wants them to do, and it involves the sanctuary. So in verse 3, the trumpets were blown to ask all the people, men and women, children, everyone, to assemble at the sanctuary and to gather. So there's times in the Bible where it's important to understand what is the gathering, what is the scattering. Okay, this was a gathering time. So then when you turn to verse 5, it's calling for one trumpet, just one, to call the leaders, a specific trumpet to call the leaders. So they would call all the people, they would call the leaders. Then in verse 5, the trumpet, the first alarm trumpet, was calling a warning and alarm about the east. And there was a difference between a call just to an assembly versus a call to an alarm. They had two different sounds there. They had thousands of people in the camp, and they needed to quickly tell them what to do when things happened that they needed to be aware of. So the first alarm was about the east. In verse 5, the first alarm was about the south. Now, both of these, the alarm to the east and the alarm to the south, told God's people that it was time to make a journey. It was time to pay attention. There was a reason for there to be an alarm. So when we're looking at applying this prophetically, we're going to want to see during a time when there's a warning about the east and a warning about the south, what is God wanting his people to do? It's time to journey. We need to pay attention. Then in verse 7, there's a call. So we've covered verses 1 through 6 of Numbers 10. And I was just starting to explain about verse 7. So in verse 7, it explains that they would blow the trumpet without an alarm, and that was a time to gather. And we saw that in the other verses of Numbers that we've already presented, that they had a gathering time with the trumpets, and that meant several things. So then in verse 8, it explains that the people who blew the trumpets were the priests. And this was actually a law, a statute that was to go on pretty much for all generations. And then in verse 9, it talks about that there were times when they would blow both a trumpet and an alarm. And this is one of the things you find in the book of Joel that's important to understand. So when they had a call that was both a trumpet and an alarm together, it was a call to war. It was a call to war because there was an enemy who was oppressing God's people in some way. But the text in the Bible, in verse 9 of Numbers, said that the alarm also had another meaning, and it was to remind the people that God heard this alarm and trumpet, and God had a promise, a commitment to answer the prayers of his people and to save his people. So it meant a trumpet and an alarm meant two things. It meant there was a war, God's people were being oppressed, and it also meant that God was committed behind his promise to save his people. So when you read the book of Joel, you find that there's a trumpet and alarm, especially in chapter 2, and God has also promises after explaining what's going to happen with that alarm and that war and the oppression to God's people. God stands behind his promises. Then in verse 10, it explains that there are several types of trumpets. A call to an assembly, a trumpet was blown, a solemn assembly, almost often with the Day of Atonement, but there were also other assemblies. It was also used when they would meet to share gladness of heart, and it was done on the first day of every month, and it was also done for offerings and sacrifices. So now as we have reviewed this in the book of Numbers, where it clearly outlines it, we want to remember that we have a very critical application to make as we look at the book of Joel. So we've looked at the trumpets and how they apply to the book of Joel. And in my next video, I'm going to show that line upon line for you to consider in your own studies. But for now, I want us to remember the critical application that we're making with this to our time. It's important to remember what it means about the alarm to the east. We've had that when you think about it. What does it mean about the alarm to the south? That's what's happening now in our time. And there have been some wonderful truths that have been found studying what it means about the South, line upon line. And what does the solemn assembly prayer mean in the book of Joel? That's what we're called to do now. That's important to study. Then remember about the false solemn assembly that Jehu did. There's 2 decrees with that, so it all involves worship. So which worship are we going to do? And when we consider which worship, it's good to study Daniel chapters 1 through 6, because those chapters talk about what happened in Daniel's time with worship, and it has application to us now. And there were a lot of laws passed about worship, trying to control the conscience against God's law. Then, remember, we also need to be aware and study, what does the Bible mean when it's talking about clouds and darkness? And really all of this is talking about the sanctuary. We're watching in the sanctuary where Jesus is ministering to us. We need to understand the book of Hebrews with this, as well as other places in the Bible. And I'm going to come back to reading in Numbers 10 Verse 9, this is such a wonderful promise that God made for us at this time. And if ye go to war in your land against the enemy that oppresses you, then ye shall blow an alarm with the trumpet, and ye shall be remembered before the Lord your God. So it's about remembrance. The alarm and the trumpet, God wants us to know He is remembering us, just like He calls us to remember Him as we worship Him. So God remembers, and ye shall be saved from your enemies. All in one promise, one verse in the Bible that applies to Joel.